The CNN studio lights felt unusually harsh as Kellyanne Conway leaned forward with the practiced confidence that had made her one of conservative media's most formidable voices. The panel discussion on voting rights legislation had been contentious from the start, but no one anticipated the personal direction it was about to take. "Congresswoman Crockett," Conway began, a slight smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "Before you lecture America about voting rights, perhaps you should explain your own problematic history with election integrity." The camera panned to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who appeared momentarily surprised by this unexpected pivot from policy to personal attack. As a freshman representative still establishing her national profile, being publicly challenged by the former senior counselor to President Trump represented a potential defining moment. "Your selective outrage is particularly interesting," Conway continued, her voice taking on the sing-song quality familiar to viewers from countless cable news appearances. "You've repeatedly claimed voter ID laws are discriminatory, yet you've never acknowledged the documented irregularities in your own primary victory. Alternative facts aren't just for Republicans, it seems." The accusation hung in the air as CNN moderator Anderson Cooper shifted uncomfortably. Conway's reference to documented irregularities had introduced an explosive claim without specifying any actual evidence, a classic example of the political communication strategy she had mastered throughout her career. "I've done my homework on your background, Congresswoman," Conway added, her tone growing increasingly dismissive. "Unlike some people who reach for the race card whenever they're challenged, I prefer to focus on actual facts about your record." The studio fell silent at this barely veiled reference to race, a line that political commentators rarely crossed explicitly in national broadcasts. The humiliation tactic was clear. Conway was attempting to paint Crockett as both hypocritical on election integrity and prone to using racial grievance to deflect legitimate criticism. For a moment, Crockett said nothing, her expression unreadable as she absorbed the unexpected personal attack. Viewers familiar with cable news confrontations might have expected defensive outrage, partisan counterattacks, or flustered denial, the typical responses when political figures face public humiliation attempts. What happened next stunned everyone in the studio and would soon captivate millions of viewers across the country. In less than 30 seconds, Congresswoman Crockett delivered a response so precise, so factually devastating, and so unexpectedly composed that it would not only neutralize Conway's attack, but completely reverse the dynamic of the entire discussion. If you want to see exactly how Congresswoman Crockett transformed what was meant to be her public humiliation into one of the most masterful takedowns in recent political media, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these explosive political confrontations that change the course of national debates overnight. Now, let's dive into this extraordinary exchange that left even veteran political observers in awe of how completely one prepared response can change the trajectory of public discourse. Kellyanne Conway had built her reputation on an uncanny ability to control media narratives. As the first woman to successfully manage a winning presidential campaign, and later as senior counselor to President Trump, she had mastered the art of redirecting uncomfortable questions, reframing unfavorable facts, and deploying personal attacks to neutralize political opponents. Her coining of the term alternative facts had become shorthand for the post-truth communication style that increasingly dominated political discourse. Conway approaches media appearances like psychological operations, one former colleague had observed in a Politico profile. She identifies vulnerabilities, establishes dominance through unexpected angles of attack, and leaves opponents responding defensively rather than advancing their own message. This approach had proven remarkably effective throughout her career, creating viral moments where opponents appeared unprepared, defensive, or hypocritical. Political observers often noted that Conway seemed to particularly relish opportunities to challenge progressive women of color, seeing these exchanges as chances to undermine accusations of racial bias by portraying her opponents as using identity politics to avoid substantive debate. Since leaving the White House, Conway had maintained her prominence through regular cable news appearances, a best-selling memoir, and a political consulting practice that kept her connected to Republican messaging strategies. Today's CNN panel discussion on voting rights legislation provided precisely the high-profile opportunity she relished, a chance to challenge Democratic narratives on a contentious issue before a national audience. Across the studio sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, whose path to Congress had followed a very different trajectory. Before winning election to the House, Crockett had established herself as a civil rights attorney in Texas, representing clients in voting rights cases and other constitutional matters. Her litigation experience had given her first-hand knowledge of how voting restrictions affected real communities, not just abstract political talking points. She approaches these issues with both legal precision and lived experience, a former legal colleague had told The Washington Post. She can discuss the technical details of election law, while also understanding how these policies impact actual voters on the ground, especially in communities that have historically faced barriers to the ballot. This combination of legal expertise and personal connection to affected communities had made Crockett an increasingly prominent voice on voting rights despite her freshman status. While some new representatives took time to find their legislative focus, Crockett had arrived with deep subject matter knowledge and the courtroom experience to articulate complex legal concepts in accessible terms. The stakes of this particular media confrontation extended far beyond personal political fortunes. The voting rights legislation under discussion represented fundamentally different visions of American democracy, with Democrats arguing that federal protection of voting access fulfilled constitutional promises of equal citizenship, while Republicans maintained that state control over election procedures represented proper constitutional federalism. This debate wasn't merely theoretical. Across the country, state legislatures had enacted hundreds of new voting laws since the 2020 election, with supporters claiming they enhanced election integrity and critics arguing they created unnecessary barriers to the ballot that disproportionately affected minority communities. The legislation being discussed would establish federal standards for early voting, mail balloting, and voter ID requirements, effectively overriding many state-level restrictions. For Conway, the confrontation represented an opportunity to advance conservative messaging on election integrity, while diminishing a rising Democratic voice through personal attack. A classic combination of policy framing and political combat that had served her well throughout her career. For Crockett, the stakes were both political and deeply personal. As someone who had represented clients directly affected by voting restrictions, she approached the issue with not just political, but moral conviction. More immediately, Conway's surprise attack presented a critical early test of her effectiveness on the national stage. Would she be defined by how she responded to this high-profile attempt at public humiliation? The packed CNN studio reflected these high stakes. Producers and camera operators sensed the escalating tension, focusing tightly on both women as the confrontation unfolded. What none of them yet realized was that Conway's tactical decision to launch a personal attack, rather than engage with policy substance, had created the perfect opening for a response that would draw on Crockett's litigation experience in ways that would leave even veteran political observers stunned by its effectiveness. "Thank you for that interesting perspective, Kellyanne," Crockett began, her voice carrying none of the defensiveness or outrage Conway's attack had clearly been designed to provoke. Instead, She spoke with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to responding to challenging judges in courtroom settings. I'd like to address your claims directly, but first, I think viewers deserve some context about election integrity that seems to be missing from your characterization. This calm opening immediately shifted the dynamic. Rather than responding emotionally to personal attacks, which would have reinforced the narrative of an inexperienced politician rattled by criticism, Crockett had chosen a substantive approach that conveyed control of both her emotions and the factual landscape. You mentioned documented irregularities in my primary victory, Crockett continued. I find that particularly interesting since my primary win was certified by the Texas Secretary of State, a Republican appointee, with no irregularities documented by any official election authority. She looked directly at Conway. Perhaps you could specify exactly which documents you're referring to. I'm always open to examining evidence, as any good attorney would be. The precision of this challenge was devastating, precisely because it focused on Conway's specific claim, rather than responding to the broader personal attack. By requesting the actual documents Conway had referenced, Crockett had called her bluff in the most direct possible way, forcing her either to produce evidence that didn't exist or to implicitly acknowledge the accusation was fabricated. Conway shifted slightly in her chair, clearly unprepared for this direct factual challenge rather than the emotional response she had anticipated. There were numerous reports in local media. Which specific reports? Crockett interjected politely but firmly. I'd be happy to address any specific allegation from a credible source. That's how evidence-based discussion works in both courtrooms and democracy. The dynamic was shifting visibly. Conway had clearly expected to rattle Crockett with personal attacks, creating a defensive or emotional response that would undermine her credibility on voting rights. Instead, Crockett was calmly but relentlessly focusing on the complete absence of factual basis for Conway's accusations. If we're going to discuss election integrity, Crockett continued, opening a folder on her lap, I think viewers would benefit from actual data rather than unsourced allegations. She extracted several documents. I have here the comprehensive report from the Heritage Foundation, certainly not a liberal organization, documenting all confirmed cases of voter fraud nationwide over the past 40 years. Among billions of votes cast, they identified fewer than 1,300 proven cases, a fraud rate of less than 0.01%. The strategic brilliance of citing a conservative source was immediately apparent. Conway couldn't dismiss the Heritage Foundation as partisan without undermining her own ideological allies. More relevantly to our discussion today, Crockett continued, turning to another document. I have the federal court rulings from Texas, North Carolina, and Wisconsin, where judges, including Republican appointees, found that specific voting restrictions were enacted with discriminatory intent or had discriminatory effects on minority communities. She looked up from the documents. These aren't partisan talking points, but legal findings based on statistical evidence and legislative records. If we're going to have a fact-based discussion about voting rights, these court determinations seem more relevant than vague, unsourced allegations about my primary victory. The tension in the studio continued to build as Crockett systematically redirected the conversation from personal attacks to documented evidence. Conway, a master of political communication, visibly struggled to regain control of an exchange that had veered dramatically from her expected script of accusation and defensive response. The American people are tired of being lectured about racism whenever common sense election security measures are proposed, Conway attempted, trying to return to broader talking points rather than engaging with the specific evidence Crockett had introduced. I haven't mentioned racism once in this conversation, Kellyanne, Crockett replied with calm precision. You're the only one who's brought up race. I've been discussing court findings based on statistical evidence and legislative records. Exactly the kind of factual basis we should all want for important policy decisions. This observation landed with particular force because it highlighted how Conway, not Crockett, had injected racial framing into the discussion, directly contradicting Conway's earlier accusation about reaching for the race card. As the exchange continued, the power dynamic shifted increasingly toward Crockett, whose measured, evidence-based responses contrasted sharply with Conway's inability to substantiate her initial accusations or effectively counter the documented evidence Crockett had presented. "Congresswoman," Conway said, visibly recalibrating her approach as her initial attack strategy unraveled. "The American people understand the difference between election security and voter suppression. No legitimate voter is prevented from casting their ballot by basic identity verification requirements." "That's an empirical claim that can be tested with evidence," Crockett replied, maintaining the same composed, methodical approach. "I have here a peer-reviewed study from the University of Pennsylvania, analyzing the impact of strict voter ID laws implemented between 2008 and 2016. She opened another document from her folder. The study found that in counties with large minority populations, voter turnout decreased by an average of 5 to 7% after strict ID laws were implemented, compared to statistically similar counties without such restrictions. In counties with predominantly white populations, the impact was less than 1%. Crockett looked directly at Conway. "These aren't anecdotes or political claims, but statistical findings published in peer-reviewed journals. If we're going to assert that no legitimate voter is prevented from casting their ballot, we should address this empirical evidence showing differential impacts across communities." The precision of this response was devastating, precisely because it didn't engage with Conway's rhetoric, but instead focused on verifiable data that directly contradicted her claim. By framing her rebuttal in terms of evidence rather than ideology, Crockett had made it exceptionally difficult for Conway to dismiss her points without appearing to reject factual reality. Anderson Cooper, recognizing the unusual substance of this exchange compared to typical political crosstalk, intervened. "Kellyanne, do you want to respond to the specific studies the Congresswoman has cited?" It was a journalistic move that reinforced the evidence-based framing Crockett had established, focusing on documented facts rather than competing assertions. Conway, a veteran of countless media appearances, appeared momentarily uncertain how to proceed when denied the opportunity to shift to unrelated talking points. "Studies can be designed to find whatever results researchers want," Conway finally responded, attempting to cast doubt on academic research broadly rather than engaging with the specific findings Crockett had cited. "That's why peer review and replication are essential parts of the scientific process," Crockett replied smoothly. "The Pennsylvania study has been replicated by researchers at 4 other universities, including the University of Chicago and Stanford, with consistent findings across different methodologies." She turned to yet another document, more directly relevant to voters themselves. "I have here affidavits from 237 eligible Texas voters who were unable to cast ballots in 2022, despite multiple attempts to comply with ID requirements. These include veterans whose VA cards weren't accepted as valid ID, elderly voters whose birth certificates contained maiden names that didn't match their current identification, and disabled voters who couldn't obtain required documentation due to mobility limitations." Crockett looked up from the affidavits. "These aren't abstract statistics, but real American citizens who were denied their constitutional right to vote despite being eligible. Their experiences deserve to be part of this conversation about the real-world impacts of these policies." The studio had grown unusually quiet as Crockett methodically presented one piece of documented evidence after another, shifting the discussion from Conway's unsupported accusations to a substantive examination of how voting policies affected actual citizens. Conway, recognizing that her typical tactics were proving ineffective against Crockett's evidence-based approach, attempted one final pivot. The Congresswoman's selective outrage about voting rights conveniently ignores the concerns millions of Americans have about election integrity after 2020. It was a clear attempt to shift the conversation to more comfortable territory. The generalized grievances about the 2020 election that had become standard talking points in conservative media. But Crockett was prepared for this redirection as well. "I appreciate you raising concerns about the 2020 election, Kellyanne," she responded, opening her final document. "I have here the complete findings from the Trump administration's own Department of Homeland Security, which concluded that the 2020 election was the most secure in American history. I also have the statements from Trump-appointed judges who dismissed over 60 election challenges due to lack of evidence." She paused briefly. "If we're genuinely concerned about election integrity, shouldn't we base policies on the findings of security experts and courts, rather than on unsubstantiated claims that even the previous administration's officials couldn't verify?" This final point completed the devastating reversal of Conway's initial attack. What had begun as an attempt to humiliate Crockett through personal accusations had been transformed, through her calm, evidence-based responses, into a systematic exposure of the factual weaknesses underlying common talking points about voting restrictions. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Conway had relied on unsupported allegations and emotional framing, while Crockett had methodically presented specific evidence from court findings, peer-reviewed studies, and the Trump administration's own security assessments. In less than 10 minutes, she had not only neutralized Conway's personal attack, but had completely reframed the entire discussion around documented facts rather than partisan assertions. Anderson Cooper, recognizing the significance of what had just transpired, turned to the camera. "We need to take a quick break. When we come back, more of our discussion on voting rights legislation with Kellyanne Conway and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett." As the cameras cut away, the studio remained silent for several moments. Crew members and producers exchanging glances that acknowledged they had just witnessed something rare in political media. Not the typical partisan shouting match, but a masterclass in how evidence-based response could completely dismantle even the most experienced political communicators' attempts at character assassination. The impact of Congresswoman Crockett's methodical dismantling of Kellyanne Conway's attack was immediate and far-reaching. Within hours of the CNN segment's conclusion, clips of the exchange had gone viral across social media platforms, with political analysts from across the spectrum acknowledging the unusual substance of the interaction. What we witnessed wasn't typical cable news theater, but a genuinely substantive contrast in communication approaches, noted media critic Brian Stelter. Conway relied on personal attacks and unsubstantiated claims, tactics that have often proven effective in political media. Crockett countered not with emotional outrage, but with specific, documented evidence that completely changed the trajectory of the discussion. The viral spread of the exchange reflected public hunger for substantive political dialogue beyond partisan talking points. Comment sections across platforms revealed viewers from diverse political perspectives expressing appreciation for Crockett's evidence-based approach, responding to personal attacks with documented facts rather than escalating rhetoric. "I'm conservative and disagree with Crockett's policy positions," wrote one typical commenter. But her response here was impressive, substantive, composed, and focused on verifiable evidence rather than personal attacks. We need more of this kind of dialogue and less character assassination from all sides. Media coverage reflected this cross-partisan appreciation for the exchange's substance. Headlines like "Evidence Trumps Accusations, the Crockett-Conway Exchange," and When Preparation Meets Provocation, a masterclass in political response, captured how the confrontation had elevated public discourse about complex policy issues, typically reduced to simplistic partisan framings. For Conway, the aftermath brought unusual challenges. A political communicator known for creating viral moments through aggressive messaging had instead become the subject of viral clips, highlighting how completely her attack had been neutralized by documented evidence. Conservative media outlets that typically celebrated Conway's combative style now faced the awkward task of covering an exchange where her approach had been so effectively countered. Conway encountered something rare in political media: an opponent who responded to personal attacks with specific evidence rather than defensive outrage, observed conservative commentator Charlie Sykes. That approach completely disrupted the usual dynamics of these confrontations, demonstrating why fact-based responses are often more effective than counter-accusations or emotional reactions. Policy experts noted that the exchange had potentially shifted the broader conversation about voting rights by focusing attention on empirical evidence rather than competing assertions about motivations. The specific studies and court findings Crockett had cited received renewed attention in subsequent media coverage, with journalists increasingly asking politicians from both parties to address the documented disparate impacts of voting restrictions, rather than merely stating their positions. The Crockett-Conway exchange demonstrated how evidence-based discussion can elevate policy debates beyond partisan talking points, explained election law expert Rick Hasen. By focusing on statistical evidence, court determinations, and documented voter experiences rather than abstract claims about intentions, Crockett created space for a more substantive conversation about the actual effects of these policies on different communities. For Crockett herself, the aftermath brought both increased prominence and enhanced credibility across partisan lines. Profile pieces highlighted not just her rising political star, but her substantive approach to policy issues, drawn from practical litigation experience rather than abstract theory. What distinguished the Congresswoman's response, observed political strategist David Axelrod, wasn't just its evidentiary substance, but its strategic discipline. Rather than allowing Conway to frame the discussion around personal accusations, she systematically redirected attention to documented facts, demonstrating how substantive engagement can be more effective than counterattack when facing provocation. This assessment was validated when several moderate Republican legislators referenced Crockett's evidence-based approach in subsequent discussions of voting policy, acknowledging that statistical findings about disparate impacts deserved serious consideration regardless of disagreements about appropriate solutions. This subtle shift in rhetoric reflected how her composed response had influenced the broader conversation about voting rights beyond partisan framing. We're seeing more nuanced discussion of these issues, noted congressional researcher Norman Ornstein. Legislators from both parties are increasingly focusing on empirical evidence about how voting policies affect different communities, rather than engaging in abstract debates about intentions or motivations. A more productive framing for developing policies that balance legitimate security concerns with ensuring all eligible citizens can actually vote. Perhaps most significantly, journalism schools and political communication programs began using video of the exchange as a teaching tool for demonstrating effective response strategies in high-pressure media environments. Professors noted that Crockett's approach, focusing on documented evidence rather than matching personal attacks with counterattacks, represented a model for how public figures could elevate political discourse while effectively neutralizing character assassination attempts. The exchange offers valuable lessons about strategic response in political communication, explained Georgetown University professor Jonathan Ladd. By remaining composed and systematically presenting specific evidence rather than responding emotionally to provocation, Crockett completely transformed what was intended as her humiliation into a showcase for her substantive expertise and preparation. For ordinary Americans watching from home, the exchange offered a rare window into how political dialogue could function beyond the typical pattern of accusation and counter-accusation that dominates cable news. The viral spread of the clip reflected public hunger for political discourse that prioritized verifiable facts over personal attacks, regardless of partisan alignment. "I don't follow politics closely," wrote one commenter, whose response was liked thousands of times. But this exchange gave me hope that substantive dialogue is still possible. No grandstanding or personal attacks in response to criticism. Just calm presentation of actual evidence. Why isn't more of our political conversation like this? The most lasting impact came in how the exchange transformed perceptions of Crockett herself. What Conway had clearly intended as a moment to diminish her credibility through personal attack had instead become Crockett's breakout moment on the national stage, establishing her not merely as a partisan voice, but as a substantive policy thinker whose composed, evidence-based response to public humiliation demonstrated exactly the kind of factual seriousness that American political discourse so often lacks. The Congresswoman demonstrated why litigation experience matters in political communication, observed media analyst Jeff Jarvis. By responding to personal attacks with specific evidence rather than emotional defensiveness, she changed the entire trajectory of the exchange in a way that elevated public understanding of complex policy issues. That's a skill developed through courtroom experience that translates powerfully to political contexts. As for the voting rights legislation itself, its path forward remained uncertain amid the complex politics of congressional procedure and partisan division. But the public conversation surrounding it had been permanently altered by 5 minutes of composed response that transformed what was supposed to be a freshman representative's public humiliation into a viral showcase for evidence-based political communication at its most effective and substantive. If you found this breakdown of the Crockett-Conway exchange informative, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analysis of the most consequential political media confrontations. Click the notification bell to make sure you never miss our coverage of the substantive exchanges that reshape public discourse beyond partisan talking points. Your support helps us continue bringing you detailed analysis that focuses on policy substance rather than merely political theater.